All right, Alexander, let's talk about what is going on in Ukraine. So, what is going on in Ukraine?
What is going on in Ukraine?
What is going on in Ukraine?
Stability, complete stagnation on the military, on the actual front lines. Fevered speculation about whether the Russians are going to pull out of Kherson region or not. And here I have to say, it's getting very out of control. And for this, I have to say this again, and we've discussed this in the past. It seems to me that the Russian authorities are partly responsible because they're not making their own views clear. For the record, I don't for the moment think that they're planning to pull out of Kherson. I think there was a bizarre incident yesterday in which a flag didn't appear on a building, and I think people built an enormous amount of speculation on this. But, what their plans are, I don't know. But in all other respects, we're seeing a very stable situation on the front lines. We're seeing very large reinforcements now coming to the Russian military. Putin now says that the total people called up was 312,000, not 300,000. And I think we're going to see more and more numbers coming. And a very, very bad situation in Ukraine's economy. And I mean, I think this is now starting to become a major concern for the West. I mean, these missile attacks on the infrastructure in Ukraine have clearly been devastating. And the G7 came together and they were talking about sending blankets and, things that will keep people warm, little stoves and things like that, which, given the kind of temperatures you get in Ukraine, aren't really a solution to the kind of problems that the cold brings. So a grim situation in Ukraine, getting grimmer all the time, stability on the front lines, uncertainty about Russian plans in Kherson region, and a major Russian reinforcement on the way. I mean, I think that basically summarizes it. And diplomatically, at a complete deadlock.
Ukraine is calling up, or they're mobilizing another 100,000
Yeah,
people,
yeah,
not to reinforce, but to replenish their losses.
yes, yes,
That's a bad sign for Ukraine.
very.
That kind of confirms roughly how many people that they have lost in this conflict.
Yes,
So I think that's
exactly.
interesting. And it looks like Russia is, if I had to take a guess as to how Russia's going to proceed, without getting into the military detail and stuff, I think they're trying to bring the Ukraine economy to its knees, and they're doing a very good job.
That's exactly what they're doing. I mean, they're playing a war of attrition. They're grinding Ukraine down. I think they attempted, as I said, this blitzkrieg back in the spring, in February, March, whose intention was to force Ukraine to the negotiating table and to come to a deal with them. And that very nearly succeeded, but it didn't succeed because, well, Boris Johnson came along and Biden came along and all these people, and they persuaded them to change course. And then since April, it's been an all-out economic war between Russia and the West has been arming Ukraine. And so the Russians have said, we've got to think of a new strategy. We don't want to sacrifice tens of thousands of our people, marching through Ukraine, fighting great battles, doing that sort of thing. So we're going to grind it down. We're going to grind down their military through attrition, and that's where the 100,000, replenishing their forces by 100,000 men comes, and we're going to grind their economy down. And eventually, what will happen is that the whole place will implode. And I think that's their strategy. I think that's becoming increasingly clear now.
Yeah, can the West bail them out from this economic implosion? Because they're also imploding.
Exactly. No. I mean, they don't have a plan, except perhaps, and this is what is becoming so worrying, to send troops into Ukraine themselves. In other words, to do their part of the Syrian option. Just, as happened in Syria, when the US sent troops into eastern Syria, and there was a kind of American occupation zone in eastern Syria, which is still there. They look like they're going one wonders whether there isn't a similar plan to do the same thing in Ukraine. Only it is a much more dangerous idea than Syria, because, I mean, the Russians, I mean, they wanted to preserve Assad's government in Syria. They wanted to prevent certain terrorist movements gaining control of Syria. But they are not committed to pushing the Americans out of Syria in that kind of way. By contrast, with Ukraine, the whole reason for the conflict is because the Russians don't want the Americans in Ukraine. So I think that if that is the plan, I'm not saying it is, by the way, but I mean, it's beginning to look to me as it might be the plan. If that is the plan, it is a very dangerous one. It's basically bluffing. It's putting some troops in, hoping that the Russians will not respond. Of course, if they do respond, what does the West do?
Yeah, but you know, the big difference between the occupying of Syria and the occupying of Ukraine, or carving out a part of Ukraine, I think that's possible. But the more I think about it, this would be a risky move for the countries that decide to carve out a part of Ukraine. From a political level, from a societal level, doesn't have any resources. I mean, at least, you know, you could say that, you know, Syria had some sort of resources that, I mean, Trump said it. Trump said, we're taking their oil. Okay, he said it. But the west of Ukraine has nothing.
No,
I mean, does it? I mean,
it's not,
everything's in the east.
everything is in the east, including the rich black earth zone, the,
So I mean, you're just
agricultural
yeah,
lands.
you're just taking on a massive destabilizing expense, and you're also
Absolutely.
taking on a society, a minority in that region, but a strong minority that despises you if you're Poland. I mean, if you're Poland, you are going to be incorporating a fairly significant minority, but nonetheless, it's significant enough that that as much as they despise Russia, they also despise the Poles.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's
So-
perhaps a good point to make, because interwar Poland had no end of trouble with these sort of people when Poland did, in fact, occupy these territories. So why would Poland, in its senses, want to bring that on itself? But the problem is the dialogue now, the whole way in which the debate is structured in the West, means that these problems, these concerns, aren't being articulated. So rather than face a total defeat in Ukraine, you know, because Ukraine is grounded down, maybe that is the plan. You know, you try and partition areas, set up a kind of Ukrainian government in exile somewhere, pretend that it's in control of these territories, even though, you know, Romania and Poland actually rule the roost in them. Hope that you can control the situation in that way. What I mean, it's a mess. It would be a mess. It would be a disaster. And as I said, the Russians would not be happy, because they would not want to see NATO troops, and certainly not American troops, in these areas. It would be a major burden on, as you said, on the societies and economies of these countries. And it would be inherently destabilizing for Europe too.
So then, how is Russia planning to deal with this part of Ukraine? Then,
We don't
do you
know.
think?
We simply do not know, and this is the mystery. I mean, I don't think the Russians will be pleased to see Polish, Romanian, and certainly not American troops in that part of Ukraine, unless, of course, some kind of a deal is done. But I don't. I think that that train has left the station. Actually, I think the most likely idea that the Russians have is, I suspect they still are thinking of setting up some kind of rump Ukraine that will be favourable to themselves. Whether that's possible, I have absolutely no idea. But the idea would be, presumably, to set up a kind of Ukrainian regime in Kiev, which would do the policing of these territories for them. A little bit like, I mean, not to press it too far, but a little bit like the Kadyrov government sorted out Chechnya for them, but on a bigger scale.
Right. So there was also, outside of the flag being taken down from this building, there was more evacuations in Kherson. Zelensky, once again, he came out and he said that there is no negotiation until they get back Donbass and Crimea. Is an evacuation being planned? Why would it be planned? I mean, I know you said that you believe they're going to stay and fight. I also believe that, or they're going to defend. I actually believe something different than just staying and defend. I actually believe that any evacuations that are taking place, and this is just a hunch, I think it's whatever activity is taking place in Kherson is in preparation for an offensive.
Yeah.
Later down the line, but
yeah,
that's just my hunch. A Russian offensive, not a Ukrainian offensive. But
yes.
What if the reverse happens? What if
Yes.
Ukraine does next week? Some people say this weekend. What if Ukraine does make another attempt at Kherson? What if this evacuation was part of knowing that attempt would be made? And where do we go from there if Russia does?
Right. A number of things.
Leaving this area.
Yes. I mean, the first thing to say is I too think that the Russians are going to stay, and I also think that this is preparation eventually for a Russian offensive. All the information we were getting until this strange incident of the flag came up yesterday was that the Russians were in fact digging in and building up and reinforcing, not that they were pulling out at all. So it does seem extremely strange, and we're getting all these very contradictory signals from Russian officials. And there's this official Stremusov, who says that things are quiet at the moment. The lines the Ukrainians have thinned their forces. They're not making any big attacks. The lines are holding, and we don't expect any real trouble for a week and a half to 2 weeks in Kherson region. So that doesn't sound like they're pulling out. On the other hand, they're pulling out the civilians. They're pulling out all the artworks and monuments from Kherson city. If this is preparatory to some sort of overall withdrawal from Kherson city across the Dnieper to the eastern bank. Well, that may make some kind of military sense in terms of, holding the lines and parrying offensives, but there will be huge anger over it in Russia. And the fact that would have been done in this hole in the corner way, I think that would there would be a massive outcry. And of course, the other thing it would do is it would bring the Ukraine military, their missile forces and all that closer to Crimea. So these are all the reasons why I just don't think it's going to happen at the end of the day. I think that politically it's too dangerous for the government in Moscow. But also, I have to say, I think that in strategic terms, it doesn't make much sense either, given that at the moment they're holding the front lines quite well. It's not like in Kharkiv. In Kharkiv, there was a big Ukrainian offensive, and the Russians weren't able to parry the blow. At the moment, the Russians are successfully parrying the blows that have been raining down. So why would they suddenly pull out? I mean, it doesn't make a great deal of sense to me. But the Russian General Staff and Putin himself don't share their plans with me. So, maybe they've looked at the situation and they've come to a different view. If they do that, if they pull out of Kherson, then, as I said, there will be major blowback in Russia.
What is do you know what the state of the Ukrainian economy is at the moment? Because I know that Ukraine is they're knocking on every door to try and get cash to stay afloat. The EU supposedly owes them $9 billion, of which they've only gotten $1 billion of it. Where is the Ukraine economy at this moment?
Well, I just saw a slew of numbers just before we did this program. Now, problem with getting numbers out of Ukraine is it's never easy, but it looks terrible. I mean, 40% of their energy system is now apparently destroyed. 30% inflation, and that's probably an underestimate. Attempts being made, as I said, as I've said previously, to preserve certain staple foods at stable prices, but I doubt that's sustainable for very long. Increasing unemployment, sharply rising unemployment, and an overall collapse in production. So, I mean, I think this is an economy that isn't a real economy anymore. To the extent that it functions at all, it is basically entirely dependent on Western handouts, and those are not going to be sufficient to keep this thing going forever, or even for very long.
How long? Very long. What does that mean?
What very long? I mean, weeks, months. By the new year, I think if things continue the way they are, I mean, it will be at critical levels. We would be seeing quite possibly a collapse of the currency by then, and an overall economic implosion.
Russia knows this.
Absolutely, that's their plan, as we said at the outset of the program.
All right. Anything else?
No, as I said, the one thing that is anomalous with all of this is the Kherson situation, which, as I said, is very difficult to read, and it would be helpful if the Russians were a bit more clear as to what their actual intentions are. But at the moment, I don't personally think that they're withdrawing, and there's been some comments from Putin which I haven't been able to track properly, but again, to the extent that I can understand them, they also seem to be suggesting that they're intending to stay.
All right. The Duran.locals.com, everybody. We are on Rockfin as well. And go to the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.